hello, and welcome. Wherever you are in the world tonight, take a slow breath and let your shoulders soften. The day is done now. There is nowhere else you need to be, and nothing else you need to solve. Sit down gently and let the sound of the waves hold the edges of your day. Tonight we're going to leave the present behind and drift into the story of the Titanic. Before the iceberg, before the panic, there was confidence, elegance, and the quiet rhythm of life at sea. You do not need to remember every date or every name. You are only here to listen slowly and safely as the story unfolds in the distance. If sleep comes before the chapter is over, let it come. That is exactly what this time is for. So close your eyes, follow the waves, and when you are ready, we will begin. Long before Titanic struck ice in the North Atlantic, it already meant something to the world that built it. It was not only a ship. It was a statement about what modern industry could achieve, about what wealthy companies could promise, and about how secure and orderly the early 20th century could appear to those who believed deeply in progress. That world is important to understand first. Without it, Titanic becomes only a disaster story. With it, the ship becomes easier to see in its proper historical setting. It belonged to an age that admired scale, discipline, engineering, and confidence. It came out of a period when large organizations seemed able to master distance, risk, and complexity with increasing success. By the early 1900s, transatlantic passenger travel had become one of the great systems of the modern world. Ships crossed regularly between Europe and North America carrying businessmen, tourists, immigrants, letters, money, cargo, and social ambition. Ocean liners were not casual vehicles. They were part of a highly visible international network. They connected ports, markets, and families. They also carried national prestige. Shipping companies therefore competed in more than one way. Speed mattered, but it was not the only measure. Reliability mattered. Comfort mattered. Scale mattered. The ability to offer an impressive and carefully managed passage across the Atlantic mattered too. A great liner could function as business asset, engineering achievement, and cultural symbol all at once. White Star Line understood this well. Rather than focusing only on the fastest crossing, it placed great emphasis on size, steadiness, and comfort. The company's strategy was to attract passengers who valued prestige, spaciousness, and the feeling of being carried across the Atlantic inside a controlled, elegant world. In that sense, Titanic was not designed merely to move people from one continent to another. It was designed to embody a certain standard of civilized travel. The ship itself was built in Belfast by Harland and Wolff, one of the most important shipbuilding firms in the world. This matters because Titanic was not the product of improvisation. It came from a major industrial system with experience, labor discipline, managerial coordination, and enormous technical capacity. Its construction required planning on a scale that already reflected the modern age. Steel, engines, fittings, interior spaces, electrical systems, communications equipment, and safety features all had to be integrated into a single floating structure. Titanic also belonged to a larger family of ships. It was one of the 3 Olympic-class liners alongside Olympic and Britannic. That class represented White Star's effort to build vessels of extraordinary size and luxury for the North Atlantic route. The point was not simply to be large for its own sake. The point was to make largeness itself part of the promise. Greater scale suggested prestige. It suggested strength. It suggested stability. To many contemporaries, a ship like Titanic did not merely look impressive. It looked trustworthy. This is one of the central historical tensions in the story. The more impressive the ship appeared, the more easily people could associate it with safety, order, and control. And to be fair, those associations were not absurd. Titanic was a real technological achievement. It included advanced features for its time. It had electrically operated watertight doors. It had a double bottom. It had extensive pumping systems. It had wireless communications. It had been designed by experienced professionals and built inside a respected industrial environment. In other words, confidence in Titanic did not come from fantasy alone. It came from the real achievements of modern engineering and organization. The ship belonged to an age in which large technical systems often did work. Railways crossed countries. Telegraph messages moved rapidly over long distances. Industrial production expanded. Governments and companies alike became more skilled at managing scale. Seen inside that wider pattern, Titanic looked like one more proof that modern systems could be trusted. It is tempting, looking backward, to treat that confidence as foolish from the start. But that is too easy. History becomes distorted when hindsight is allowed to flatten the uncertainty of the past. The people who designed, built, inspected, and boarded Titanic did not experience the ship as a doomed symbol. They experienced it as part of a world that had grown used to believing in competence. Not perfect competence, but enough competence to make ordinary trust feel reasonable. That same confidence was visible in the ship's interiors and public image. Titanic was not conceived as a harsh or purely mechanical vessel. It was supposed to feel ordered, calm, and distinguished. Its first-class accommodations were especially important to this image. Public rooms, fine materials, spacious interiors, and careful service all contributed to the impression that the ship offered not only passage, but an atmosphere. Even for people who would never sail in first class, the fame of such spaces added to the ship's aura. But Titanic was not built only for the wealthy. Like other transatlantic liners, it also carried second-class and third-class passengers, each with very different expectations and experiences. This is important because the ship reflected the larger social structure of its time. It was luxurious, but also stratified. It was modern, but not equal. It was efficient, but not socially neutral. The same vessel that symbolized technological progress also carried the class distinctions of the Edwardian world within its own decks, corridors, dining rooms, and sleeping spaces. That is why Titanic should be understood not only as an engineering object, but as a floating social order. It brought together wealth, labor, migration, service, hierarchy, and industrial discipline. Officers, engineers, firemen, stewards, wireless operators, wealthy travelers, ordinary families, and immigrants all became part of one carefully managed system. The ship moved through the ocean, but it also carried a miniature version of the larger world that produced it. Even its route reinforced this sense of order. The North Atlantic Passage was demanding, but by 1912 it was also familiar and structured. Companies planned departures carefully. Ports were integrated into wider schedules. The crossing was not imagined as a leap into the unknown. It was part of an international routine. That routine gave people confidence because repetition tends to look like mastery. When something has been done many times before, the mind begins to treat it not as dangerous, but as normal. This is one reason Titanic later became so powerful in memory. It did not sink at the edge of a pre-modern world. It sank inside a system that believed strongly in modern reliability. The ship represented a society that had learned to trust scale, expertise, and administration. That trust was not empty, yet it carried limits that were easier to see only after catastrophe. Those limits were already present in smaller ways before the voyage began. Safety regulations, for example, had not fully kept pace with the increasing size of passenger liners. Lifeboat requirements were shaped by older assumptions and older categories. This does not mean the ship was launched without concern for safety. It means the broader system still contained mismatches between technical growth and regulatory imagination. Titanic existed at the meeting point between real innovation and inherited assumptions. The same is true of public language around the ship. Later memory often compresses everything into the phrase unsinkable. In reality, the history is more complicated. Confidence in the ship did exist, and strong claims about its safety circulated. But the popular legend that Titanic was simply advertised in a crude and absolute way is not the whole story. What matters more is the general climate of belief. The ship came from a culture that expected very large technical systems to be manageable, even when nature remained powerful and uncertainty could not be eliminated. That broader confidence helps explain why Titanic felt so modern. It combined engineering, luxury, communications technology, disciplined labor, and global movement into one object. It was elegant, but it was also industrial. It was graceful above deck, but below that visible surface were furnaces, boilers, engines, coal bunkers, pumps, and teams of workers whose labor sustained the illusion of effortless calm. That contrast matters. Ships like Titanic often appear in memory as symbols of beauty or tragedy, but they were also hard-working systems. Their smoothness depended on hidden effort. Their elegance depended on fuel, maintenance, scheduling, and human labor. Even at the height of modern confidence, order was something built and sustained, not something that existed naturally on its own. This is part of what makes Titanic such a fitting subject for dream history. The story begins not in panic but in confidence. Not in visible failure but in carefully arranged success. The ship's meaning comes partly from the fact that it seemed to stand on the side of order. It looked like a vessel from a world that believed that knew how to manage risk, distance, and complexity. It seemed to carry an age that trusted itself. And yet that trust was not the same as invulnerability. The age that built Titanic was brilliant in many ways, but it was also inclined to overestimate the strength of its own systems. That overestimation did not guarantee disaster in every case, but it did shape how people thought about engineering, safety, and control. Titanic inherited that confidence because it was one of its finest expressions. So before the ship becomes a site of loss, it must first be seen as it was meant to be seen. As a product of ambition, prestige, technical skill, and social order. It was admired because it seemed to gather the strengths of its time into one moving structure. It crossed from shipyard to sea, not as a warning, but as an achievement. That is where the history properly begins. Not with the iceberg and not with the final plunge into darkness, but with a world that had learned to trust impressive things. Titanic carried steel, engines, passengers, mail, and coal. It also carried the self-confidence of the age that built it. To understand why its loss struck so deeply, we first have to understand why so many people found it so easy to believe in the ship at all. In the next chapter, that larger confidence narrows into the social life of the voyage itself. We move from shipyards, companies, and industrial prestige into the floating world on board. There we begin to see how Titanic functioned day by day, and how class, routine, labor, and comfort gave the crossing its sense of order before danger entered the story. When Titanic finally left Southampton on 10 April 1912, it did not feel like the beginning of a legend. It felt like the beginning of a voyage. That distinction matters. The ship was large, admired, and technically impressive, but once it entered service, it also became practical. People boarded with luggage, tickets, concerns, habits, and expectations. Crew members reported to stations. Offices supervised departure. Messages were sent. Meals were prepared. Coal had to be fed to the furnaces. A highly organized machine, social as much as mechanical, began to move. This is the level on which Titanic first needs to be understood in its second chapter. The ship was not simply a symbol crossing the Atlantic. It was a working world with routines, divisions, responsibilities, and different experiences depending on where a person stood inside its hierarchy. That hierarchy was not incidental. It shaped how the vessel felt, how its spaces were arranged, and how life on board unfolded from hour to hour. Southampton was the great starting point of that floating world. From there, Titanic began its maiden voyage, with passengers and crew drawn from many backgrounds. Some were wealthy and experienced travelers. Some were middle-class passengers moving for work, family, or ordinary comfort. Others were emigrants hoping to build a new life across the Atlantic. Still others were not passengers at all, but workers whose labor made the ship function. What united them was not equality but proximity. For a few days, all were held inside one vessel moving through the same sea. After leaving Southampton, Titanic called at Cherbourg in France, and then at Queenstown in Ireland, now known as Cope. These stops remind us that the ship was part of an established route rather than an isolated adventure. Passengers boarded and disembarked according to a well-understood transatlantic rhythm. The voyage was prestigious, but it was also structured. The ship connected ports in sequence, and each port added to the sense that Titanic belonged to a wider network of movement, commerce, and migration. What people experienced on board, however, varied sharply by class. This is one of the most important realities of Titanic. The ship was not a single shared social space. It was a layered world in which comfort, privacy, decoration, access, and service differed significantly from one section to another. The language of first class, second class, and third class described much more than ticket price. It described status, expectation, and the practical geography of life aboard. First class represented the most visible face of Titanic. It offered spacious cabins, elegant public rooms, elaborate meals, attentive service, and surroundings designed to reassure wealthy passengers that ocean travel could be almost as comfortable as life on land. The ship's prestige was closely tied to this environment. First-class passengers did not simply purchase transportation. They purchased a controlled atmosphere of refinement. For them, the liner was meant to feel less like a difficult crossing and more like an extension of a civilized social world. Second class occupied a different but still respectable place. It was not merely a reduced version of first class. In many cases, it offered a standard that would have been considered strong, even on other ships. Teachers, professionals, clergy, and families of modest means could travel in surroundings that felt ordered and comfortable without belonging to the wealthiest layer of society. This matters because Titanic's appeal was not limited to the very rich. It also embodied a wider confidence in middle-class respectability and orderly mobility. third class, often later romanticized or simplified, deserves careful treatment. It included many immigrants and working people traveling under tighter conditions, but it was not simply a zone of misery. On a liner like Titanic, third class could still represent improvement over older standards of transatlantic travel. At the same time, it remained clearly separate. Cabins, common spaces, movement through the ship, and access to certain areas all reflected social distinctions that were built into the vessel's design. Titanic carried the assumptions of Edwardian society across the Atlantic rather than leaving them behind at the dock. This stratified arrangement shaped not only comfort but rhythm. Meals did not occur in identical spaces or under identical standards. Promenades were not equally shared. Privacy differed. The tone of conversation, dress, and daily expectation varied from one deck to another. Even the emotional meaning of the voyage could differ. For some, the crossing was an extension of privilege. For some, it was a practical passage. For others, it was part of a life-changing migration. Titanic held all of these journeys at once. Yet class alone does not explain the life of the ship. The other essential dimension is labor. Much of Titanic's calm depended on work that remained partly hidden from passengers. The visible face of water rested on a disciplined workforce that operated around the clock. Officers navigated and supervised. Stewards maintained cabins, served meals, and managed the needs of passengers. Engineers and technical staff watched over the mechanical systems on which the entire ship depended. Firemen and trimmers worked in punishing heat below deck, feeding coal into the furnaces, and sustaining the engines that gave Titanic its movement. This hidden labor is easy to overlook because the ship was designed to conceal strain behind smoothness. The point of a luxury liner was not to display effort, but to transform effort into calm. A bright dining room, a polished corridor, or a warm cabin did not look like the result of industrial labor, but they were. Titanic's order was continuously produced. It depended on schedules, discipline, maintenance, and a strict chain of command. What passengers experienced as routine comfort was, underneath, the result of constant work. That structure helps explain why the ship felt so stable during the first part of the voyage. Order on board was not accidental. It was reinforced every hour. Bells, watches, meal times, service patterns, and operational responsibilities divided the day into recognizable forms. A passenger might read, write letters, walk, converse, dine, or simply observe the sea. For the crew, meanwhile, shifts continued, equipment had to be maintained, and the regular needs of a great vessel never stopped. The ship therefore carried two forms of time at once: leisure above, labor below. Wireless communication was part of this modern order too. Marconi operators handled messages that linked the ship to a wider world beyond the horizon. Some messages concerned navigation and operations, while others came from passengers using the novelty and convenience of near-instant long-distance communication. This feature contributed to Titanic's modern identity. The ship was not only moving people physically, it also remained connected to systems of information that helped make distance feel more manageable. It is important, however, not to turn this chapter into a simple contrast between luxury and hardship. Titanic was more complex than that. The ship functioned because its different parts were integrated into one system. First class depended on labor. Third class depended on systems of transport and administration. Officers depended on engineering staff. Service staff depended on schedules, supplies, and hierarchy. A ship of this scale could not work through prestige alone. It worked because modern organization was able for a time to hold many unequal parts together inside one disciplined whole. That whole also encouraged a specific emotional atmosphere: confidence. Once the voyage was underway, the ship was meant to feel not dramatic, but dependable. The early days of the crossing were not defined by visible danger. They were defined by continuity. The ship moved from port to port, then westward across the ocean, carrying with it a sense that things were proceeding as they should. The machinery worked. The route was known. The passengers settled into habit. The crew carried out assigned duties. The larger ship that in memory now seemed singular and doomed was, in lived time, becoming ordinary to those aboard it. This ordinariness is historically significant. Disasters often become difficult to understand because later memory washes away the long stretch of normality that came before them. Titanic did not feel like crisis from the moment it sailed. It felt like routine framed by elegance and scale. And because it felt routine, trust deepened. Each ordinary hour strengthened the impression that the ship was functioning exactly as intended. That is why the social life of Titanic matters so much. It reveals how security is lived before it is tested. People trust systems not because they have solved every danger, but because those systems continue to perform normality day after day. On Titanic, class structure, service discipline, route familiarity, and technical regularity all contributed to that normality. The ship seemed to justify the confidence placed in it simply by continuing to do what a great liner was supposed to do. It is also why this chapter must remain patient. The later disaster becomes historically clearer when we first see how complete the illusion of ordinary order really was. A vessel like Titanic did not merely carry passengers. It carried a social arrangement that made confidence feel natural. It moved through the cold Atlantic not as a site of visible strain, but as a place where meals were served, cabins were attended, letters were written, engines turned, and distinctions of class remained intact even far from shore. This floating order gave shape to the days before collision. It made the voyage legible. It told passengers how to behave, where to go, what to expect, and what sort of world they were inhabiting. The ship was modern not only because of its steel and machinery, but because it could impose routine across so many people at once. That discipline, combined with comfort, gave the crossing its sense of calm. Yet beneath that calm lay the limits of the same system. A ship divided by class, dependent on hidden labor, and sustained by ordinary assumptions could feel perfectly secure right up to the edge of danger. The better the system worked in normal conditions, the easier it became to trust its continuation. That does not mean Titanic was doomed because it was orderly. It means the confidence produced by order can make risk harder to imagine while everything still appears to be functioning. So by the time Titanic had completed its early stops and moved fully into the Atlantic crossing, it had become what its builders and operators intended: a floating world of class, routine, service, and confidence. The ship felt complete. Its hierarchies were intact. Its rhythms were steady. Its passengers and crew had entered the practical life of the voyage. That is the world we carry forward into the next chapter, because danger does not arrive into emptiness. It arrives into systems that already exist. To understand the final day of Titanic's voyage, we now have to follow this world into the cold and quiet ocean beyond the early route, where warnings began to accumulate, and routine confidence met conditions it did not fully know how to read. By the time Titanic had passed its early stops and settled fully into the westbound crossing, the ship had entered the part of the voyage that could feel almost abstract. The shoreline was gone. The route was known. The social order on board had already taken shape. Meals, watches, service routines, and mechanical labor continued as they should. What remained outside the ship was distance, weather, darkness, and the cold discipline of the North Atlantic. This is the setting in which the story becomes quieter, not louder. That quiet is historically important. The final day before the collision was not marked by obvious disorder. It was marked by continuity. Titanic did not move toward the iceberg inside an atmosphere of visible crisis. It moved through a sea that many on board would still have experienced as controlled, ordinary, and professionally managed. That ordinariness is one of the reasons the disaster became possible. Human beings are rarely alarmed by risk in the abstract. They are more often guided by routine. If the engines continue, the officers remain composed, the day proceeds, and familiar structures hold, then danger can remain intellectually present without becoming emotionally immediate. Titanic was traveling through a region in which ice was known to matter, but knowledge of risk is not the same thing as the felt expectation of catastrophe. On 14 April 1912, several iceberg warnings reached the ship. This fact matters greatly, but it must be handled carefully. The later tendency is to read those warnings as though they should have produced a simple and immediate emergency response. History is usually less clean than that. Warnings arrive inside systems and interpret them according to habits, priorities, workloads, and ordinary judgment. That is what happened here. Wireless operators aboard Titanic handled not only navigational messages, but also passenger traffic. This is a crucial detail because the wireless room was part of both the ship's operational life and its commercial modernity. Passengers could send messages outward. The ship could receive information from other vessels. But this did not mean that all information traveled through a calm and perfectly ordered chain in which every warning automatically carried equal force at every moment. Communication depended on people, pressure, timing, and context. Some of the warnings received that day concerned field ice and icebergs along the route. Officers in the bridge were not ignorant of these conditions. The ship was not moving through a completely unknown danger, but neither was the presence of ice in the North Atlantic a shocking revelation. That route had long required navigational judgment. What mattered on 14 April was not one single message alone, but the cumulative effect of conditions, assumptions, and decisions that did not fully shift the emotional or operational tone on board. This is where hindsight can become misleading. Once known disasters in the mind, every earlier signal begins to glow with fatal importance. But that is not how contemporaries lived inside the moment. Titanic remained a large mail and passenger liner on a scheduled crossing. It had officers who believed they were performing professional duties. It had lookouts on watch. It had experienced men on the bridge. It had a captain, Edward J. Smith, whose presence itself contributed to continuity and confidence. Nothing about the ship's visible structure said that the boundary between ordinary caution and catastrophe had already been crossed. The sea conditions that night, however, were not favorable to visual detection in the way many people later imagined. The ocean was unusually calm. This may sound reassuring, but it carried a hidden problem. In rougher seas, breakers at the base of an iceberg can make its presence easier to detect. On a very still sea, that sign can disappear. Darkness, temperature, and visibility then matter differently. What appears peaceful to one observer may be more deceptive to another. The night was also exceptionally clear and cold. That too could be misleading. Clear weather does not remove danger. It changes its form. Visibility without moonlight on a still and dark ocean does not produce the same kind of contrast that people often imagine from land. The ship was moving through a space in which emptiness could itself conceal hazard. A calm surface could look almost featureless. The horizon could offer little help. What seemed like quiet could in practice reduce warning. This is one reason the lookouts matter so much in the story. They were not decorative figures placed in the crow's nest to satisfy tradition. They were part of a real chain of detection and response. They stood in the cold, searching for signs ahead, while the ship continued under assumptions shaped by routine transatlantic movement. The problem was not that no one was looking. The problem was that the conditions under which they were looking gave too little margin. Titanic also continued at substantial speed. This fact has become central in later arguments, and understandably so, but it should not be flattened into a single moral lesson. The ship was not racing wildly through obvious danger in a way that everyone aboard would have recognized as reckless. It was moving within a culture of maritime judgment in which speed, schedule, confidence in command, and awareness of risk coexisted. That culture deserves explanation rather than only condemnation. Large liners were expected to cross efficiently. Officers were used to operating inside a professional environment where caution did not necessarily mean dramatic slowing at every sign of difficulty. The Atlantic route had its dangers, but it also had its habits. One of those habits was trust in navigational competence. Another was confidence in the ship's capabilities. Titanic inherited both. That is why the last day before the collision should be understood as a meeting point between caution and continuity. Warnings existed. Professional awareness existed. Yet the ship still felt like a ship in command of itself. Meals were served. Conversations continued. Passengers wrote messages or moved through public rooms. The great body of the vessel pressed westward through water that seemed quiet enough to permit confidence. There is nothing theatrical in that picture. That is precisely why it matters. Inside the wireless room, men like Jack Phillips and Harold Bride worked within a growing stream of communication. Their role has often been remembered because wireless now feels to us like a bridge between uncertainty and rescue. In one sense, it was. It allowed ships to share information and later to summon help. But on the day before the sinking, it was also part of an ordinary workload. Messages were not handled in a mythical realm outside human pressure. They were handled by operators with tasks, interruptions, priorities, and timing constraints. The modernity of wireless did not eliminate friction. It only changed the form of it. Seen this way, Titanic's final day becomes less mysterious, even as it remains tragic. The ship was not blind in the sense of having no information. Nor was it fully prepared in the sense of having transformed information into a new operating mood. It was moving through that uneasy middle ground in which signs of danger are real, but not yet strong enough to overturn the force of routine. Routine is often underestimated in historical explanation. We like dramatic causes because they simplify the story. But many disasters occur because ordinary processes continue a little too long under conditions that have already changed. The officers are still officers. The ship is still a ship. The route is still the route. The day still feels like part of the same voyage that began in Southampton. And because it all still appears continuous, the threshold at which action should change can be hard to feel from within. There was also the broader authority of the ship itself. Titanic's size and steadiness did psychological work. A person aboard such a vessel could easily believe that serious danger, if it existed at all, would remain manageable. That belief did not have to be spoken aloud to influence perception. It could live quietly in the atmosphere of the ship. The great liner still moved cleanly through the sea. Its public rooms remained orderly. Its hierarchy remained intact. Its machinery continued below. Nothing near ship's visible life yet required passengers or crew to imagine the end. This is why the chapter has to resist the temptation to become accusatory too early. There were later inquiries, later debates, and later arguments over responsibility. Those matter, but they belong more fully to the aftermath. Before the collision, what we need to understand is not yet blame, but mental framework. Titanic's officers and lookouts were not standing in a theatrical scene of obvious doom. They were operating inside a professional and social order that had not yet admitted catastrophe into its own imagination. At the same time, it would be equally wrong to describe the day as wholly innocent. Risk was present. Ice warnings were real. Conditions were quietly unfavorable. The sea's calmness removed one kind of visual cue. Darkness and cold sharpened uncertainty rather than reducing it. Speed limited margin. Wireless communication carried important information but did not instantly reconfigure the ship's behavior. Several factors that might look ordinary when viewed separately became dangerous when gathered together. That gathering is the real historical key. Titanic did not move toward loss because one person ignored one warning in isolation. It moved toward loss because communication, environment, confidence, speed, and professional habit aligned badly at the same time. This is more unsettling than a simple villain story because it suggests how disaster can emerge from systems that are functioning normally by their own internal standards. By late 14 April then, Titanic was crossing not only a cold ocean but a narrowing margin. The ship still felt composed. The structure of class, labor, and routine still held. The bridge was still the bridge. The wireless room was still the wireless room. The lookouts were still searching ahead. Yet the quiet of the sea had become deceptive, and the confidence that made the voyage feel secure was no longer matched by the conditions outside the hull. This is the last stretch in which Titanic can still be understood primarily as a vessel continuing its route. The next chapter begins at the point where continuity breaks. The iceberg does not appear out of legend or prophecy. It emerges inside a world that still believes itself to be moving normally. That is what gives the collision its historical force. Disaster does not replace calm from the outside. It arrives through the failure of calm to recognize in time what is already there in the dark. At 11:40 p.m. on 14 April 1912, the long continuity of Titanic's voyage broke. The break, however, was not immediately understood by everyone in the same way. This is one of the most important things to keep in mind. Later memory often imagines the collision as an instantly obvious turning point, a moment when ship and passengers alike must have recognized catastrophe at once. The historical reality was quieter, more uneven, and therefore more dangerous. The iceberg did not arrive inside a scene of noise and visible chaos. It emerged out of darkness, out of the same calm sea that had already made detection difficult. The lookouts saw it ahead, and the warning passed to the bridge. Evasive action followed, but not quickly enough to avoid contact altogether. Titanic did not suffer a dramatic head-on crash that would have instantly shocked the entire ship. Instead, the iceberg brushed along the starboard side and damaged the hull below the waterline. That difference mattered because it helped make the first response feel uncertain rather than final. For many people aboard, the sensation was not overwhelming. Some noticed a shudder, a change in vibration, or a strange interruption in the usual feel of the ship. Others noticed almost nothing at all. A great liner was a large and layered environment. Sound, vibration, and motion were not experienced identically in every part of it. People in public rooms, cabins, working spaces, or below-deck areas could register the same event very differently. This helps explain why there was no single emotional reaction in the first minutes after impact. The officers on the bridge, however, did not have the luxury of ambiguity for long. A collision with ice at sea had to be treated seriously, even if the full extent of damage was not yet known. Orders were given. The ship was assessed. Men were sent to inspect affected areas. The problem in those first minutes was not simple inaction. It was uncertainty. Titanic was still afloat. Its lights still worked. Its internal order had not yet visibly collapsed. The question was not whether something had happened, but what exactly that something meant. That question led toward the technical heart of the disaster. Titanic had been built with multiple watertight compartments, and this system formed part of the broader confidence surrounding the ship's safety. The compartments were intended to contain flooding and preserve buoyancy after certain kinds of damage. This was a real safety measure, not a fantasy. But like many technical solutions, it was based on assumptions about the scale and pattern of the damage the ship was expected to withstand. The iceberg contact did not fit those assumptions well. The damage extended across a series of compartments rather than being limited to a smaller, more containable area. Water began entering the ship through openings below the waterline. The issue was not that Titanic lacked protective thinking. The issue was that the flooding spread beyond the margin the design could absorb while still keeping the ship afloat. This is where Thomas Andrews becomes especially important. As the ship's designer, and a man intimately familiar with its structure, he was in a rare position to interpret the significance of what inspectors reported. Andrews did not rely only on abstract confidence in the vessel. He understood the design in practical terms, and it was through that practical understanding that the true gravity of the situation began to take shape. When Andrews concluded that the ship could not remain afloat, the meaning of the collision changed completely. Titanic had not suffered a troublesome but survivable accident. It had suffered fatal damage. Yet even then, this conclusion did not instantly transform the entire ship into open panic. Knowledge moves unevenly. Institutions react in layers. Officers may know one thing, engineers another, passengers another. A crisis becomes socially real only as information spreads, is believed, and begins to alter behavior. That delay mattered enormously. The ship had time before sinking, but not unlimited time. In one sense, Titanic did not fail immediately. It remained afloat for hours after the collision. In another sense, once the flooding pattern was understood, the end had already been set in motion. The vessel's survival was no longer a question of confidence or morale. It was a question of time, water, and physical design. This is one of the cruelest features of the disaster. Because the ship did not disappear at once, it still offered the appearance of order for a while, after the fatal moment had already arrived. Electric lights remained on. The decks were still there. The rooms had not all dissolved into chaos. To many aboard, especially those not close to the technical center of the crisis, Titanic could still look like a ship that had been inconvenienced rather than mortally wounded. That mismatch between appearance and reality shaped everything that followed. Had the danger been obvious in the most dramatic possible way, the ship would likely have entered a different emotional condition sooner. But Titanic's fatal damage was progressive. The threat deepened with time. This made the early phase of response uncertain, and uncertainty is often more dangerous than noise. It encourages hesitation. It allows people to hope that the worst interpretation may still be wrong. The technical logic of the sinking also deserves clear explanation. Titanic's watertight compartments could protect the ship only up to a point. Once too many were opened to the sea, the basic arithmetic of buoyancy changed against the vessel. Water rising in the forward sections increased pressure on the ship's trim, lowering the bow further and making additional flooding more likely as time passed. In other words, the damage was not static. It was cumulative. The ship was not simply leaking. It was being drawn into a process that became harder to reverse with every passing interval. This is why the collision should not be imagined as the whole disaster in miniature. The impact was the beginning of the fatal chain, not the entire event. The greater disaster lay in what the impact had made possible inside the structure of the ship. Once enough compartments were opened, Titanic's survival depended on conditions that no longer existed. Pumps, discipline, and hope could not restore the lost margin built into the design. None of this means that the ship had been badly designed in every respect, or that all confidence in it had been absurd. That would be too simple. Titanic had real strengths. Its systems reflected serious engineering, but engineering always lives inside assumptions. The ship had not been designed for every possible form of damage, and the actual flooding pattern exceeded what its safety logic could manage. The problem, then, was not that technology had been fake. The problem was that real technology still had limits. That tension between technical achievement and technical limit is one of the central themes of Titanic. A ship can be advanced and still fail. A design can be serious and still prove insufficient under particular conditions. Modernity often encourages faith in systems precisely because those systems usually do work. But when they encounter the outer edge of their assumptions, failure can arrive not through obvious incompetence, but through a mismatch between expectation and event. Inside the ship, this growing reality had to be translated into action. Officers could not simply announce abstract technical conclusions. They had to turn knowledge into procedure. Lifeboats would need to be uncovered and prepared. Passengers would need to be managed. Crew would need instructions. And all of this had to happen while many people still did not fully understand that the ship was doomed. This gap between what was known at the center and what was felt across the wider vessel is one of the defining features of the first phase after collision. It is also why the chapter must remain restrained. Panic was not immediate and universal. Some passengers were uncertain, irritated, sleepy, skeptical, or merely curious. Crew behavior varied by role and location. The point is not that no one sensed danger, but that the ship's social and visual order did not vanish in a single instant. Titanic remained for a time a recognizable liner even after its fate had already been sealed below the surface. The bridge and technical staff were therefore confronting two realities at once. One reality was physical. Water was entering the ship and the vessel could not survive the extent of flooding. The other was social. The ship still had to be governed as if order could be maintained long enough to convert diminishing time into organized response. That second task was extraordinarily difficult. It required authority, interpretation, and speed, all inside an atmosphere where many people still lacked full understanding. This is where the collision becomes more than an accident. It becomes a test of how a modern system responds when the facts at its center are more severe than the atmosphere at its surface. Titanic had been built to convey confidence. After 11:40 p.m., that same confidence became part of the problem because it softened the emotional meaning of the danger during the very minutes when time mattered most. The narrowing of time is the true close of this chapter. Once Andrews understood the ship's condition, every delay became heavier. Not every minute was lost through confusion, and not every hesitation was irrational. But the disaster had entered a phase in which time itself had become the central resource, and it was already running out. The ship still floated. The decks were still lit. Voices still carried through familiar rooms. Yet beneath all that visible continuity, the margin of survival was shrinking. That shrinking margin leads directly into the next chapter. The collision did not instantly destroy Titanic, but it transformed the voyage into an evacuation problem the ship was not prepared to solve fully. Lifeboats, communication, access, discipline, uncertainty in class would now determine who moved closer to safety and who remained trapped inside the long descent of the ship. The iceberg had touched the hull only briefly. What followed would last much longer. Once Titanic's officers and Thomas Andrews understood that the ship could not remain afloat, the problem changed from diagnosis to evacuation. That did not mean that everyone aboard suddenly shared the same understanding. The ship was still lit. The decks were still in place. The interior still retained much of its familiar order. In those conditions, moving hundreds of people out into the cold night and down into small boats was not a simple matter of giving an order and watching it happen. It required people to believe what many still found difficult to accept. This is why the evacuation began inside an atmosphere of hesitation. The danger was real, but it did not yet look dramatic in every part of the ship. Many passengers had been awakened from sleep. Some arrived on deck wrapped in coats or blankets, trying to understand why they had been called up at all. To step away from a large illuminated liner into a comparatively small lifeboat suspended over black water did not feel at first like the obvious path to safety. In the earliest stage of the evacuation, Titanic still looked more secure than the boats hanging beside it. That hesitation mattered because time was already limited. It also mattered because Titanic had never carried enough lifeboat space for everyone aboard. This fact must be stated clearly because it shaped everything that followed. The ship carried 20 lifeboats, and those boats could hold only a little more than half of the people on board. This was not a last-minute oversight made after the collision. It belonged to the larger structure of the age. Safety regulations had not fully kept pace with the size of the newest liners, and lifeboat provision was still shaped by older assumptions. Titanic had been designed to float as a ship of confidence, not to evacuate every person aboard into boats during a total failure. That structural limit does not mean that the evacuation was pointless. The boats still represented the only immediate path to survival. But it does mean that the process was burdened from the start by arithmetic. Even if every boat had been filled efficiently, there was never enough room for all. The tragic question then was not simply whether lifeboats would be launched. It was how quickly, how fully, and for whom. The launching itself was slower and more uneven than later memory often assumes. Crew had procedures, and some drills had been carried out, but a night evacuation of a vessel this large, in these conditions, with so many passengers only partly aware of the danger, was not something that modern order could perform without friction. Lifeboats had to be uncovered, swung out, provisioned, loaded, and lowered. Officers had to impose direction on a situation that still felt uncertain to many civilians standing before them. This is one reason why several of the early boats left with empty seats. The empty places did not exist because no one cared whether they were filled. They existed because the logic of the moment was unstable. Passengers were reluctant. Crew were cautious about overloading unfamiliar boats in darkness. Officers were interpreting instructions under pressure while still trying to maintain order. Some did not yet know how rapidly the ship's condition would worsen. In those first launches, uncertainty consumed capacity that could never be recovered later. Different officers also enforced the principle of women and children, first with different degrees of strictness. This point deserves careful treatment. The phrase is often remembered as if it had a single, uniform meaning across the entire ship, but in practice it did not operate so neatly. On some parts of the boat deck, men were excluded more rigidly. On others, if no more women were immediately available, places might be filled more flexibly. Procedure existed, but procedure was filtered through personalities, local judgment, incomplete information, and the pressure of passing minutes. The boat deck itself also imposed its own discipline. Passengers did not simply step into safety the moment they reached open air. They had to be identified, grouped, directed, and brought to boats that were being prepared one by one. Some boats needed crewmen assigned to them so they could be lowered and handled once in the water. People in heavy clothing had to approach the edge of a large moving ship in darkness and trust ropes, davits, and orders they did not fully understand. In those conditions, evacuation was always going to be slower than it appeared in hindsight. What later generations see as obvious emergency movement had to be created in real time by human beings working against disbelief, cold in the strange visual stability of the ship itself. Social structure mattered as well, though not in the simplest mythic way. Titanic was not a flat social world where every passenger stood equally close to the boat deck, equally informed, and equally ready to move. First-class passengers were physically closer to certain upper deck spaces and generally had easier access to information and to crew attention. Third-class passengers were located deeper in the ship and farther from the places where boats were being loaded. Their routes upward were longer, more confusing, and more dependent on guidance. Language differences, unfamiliarity with the ship, family responsibilities, and the simple fact of being farther away all mattered. This does not mean that every third-class passenger was simply locked below in one uniform act of exclusion. That popular image is too simple, but it would be equally misleading to pretend that access was equal once the emergency began. Titanic's class structure had shaped movement and space from the beginning of the voyage, and in the crisis those patterns remained real. In a ship already running short of time, even a modest delay in finding the right staircase, the right corridor, or the right source of instruction could become decisive. The experience of the crew must also remain visible in this chapter. Stewards, seamen, engineers, firemen, and wireless operators were not passive background figures inside a famous tragedy. They were the people trying to convert a failing ship into a temporary system of survival. Some were helping passengers on deck. Others were working below, keeping systems going for as long as possible. Many continued to serve the ship even after it was clear that not all of them would leave it. The order preserved for as long as it was did not happen naturally. It was labor, discipline, and duty under extreme pressure. Among the most important men in that labor were the wireless operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride. Their work connected the sinking ship to the wider Atlantic world. Titanic did not vanish in total isolation. distress calls went out into the night. Phillips and Bride transmitted urgently, sending calls that signaled the ship's condition and position. In a disaster shaped by time, their work mattered because it turned to the crisis from a private emergency into a call for rescue across distance. Wireless was not the only signal sent into the darkness. Distress rockets also rose above the ship at intervals, turning the upper deck into a place of communication as well as evacuation. This detail matters because it shows how the disaster unfolded on several levels at once. The ship was not only loading boats, it was also trying to announce through light as well as radio that normal order had ended and help was needed immediately. Yet even signals can fail to close distance quickly enough. A warning sent into the night still depends on how fast it is received, understood, and acted upon. This is where RMS Carpathia enters the story. Carpathia received Titanic's distress messages and altered course to come at speed. That decision was critical, and it would save many of the people who reached the lifeboats. But rescue still had to travel through the North Atlantic in darkness. Wireless could summon help, but it could not erase distance. Carpathia was coming, yet for the people on Titanic, the ship itself was sinking faster than rescue could arrive. As the minutes passed, the atmosphere on board changed. What had begun in hesitation moved gradually toward comprehension. More boats were launched. More passengers recognized that this was not a precaution but a final process. The angle of the deck changed little at first, then more noticeably. The cold became harder to ignore. The familiar routines of a passenger liner gave way to the narrower logic of exit, access, and time. The lifeboat shortage became increasingly cruel as that understanding spread. In the early phase, some boats had left partly filled because the ship still looked safer than the sea. Later, when the danger became impossible to mistake, the cost of those empty spaces became unbearable. Capacity lost early could not simply be called back. The boats, already lowering away from Titanic, carried with them not only survivors, but also the evidence that the ship's chances had narrowed more quickly than many had believed. For those still on board, survival depended on a shrinking combination of location, timing, judgment, and luck. Families were separated by the rules of embarkation and by the physical structure of the ship. Some people reached the deck too late to find space in a boat. Some hesitated and changed their minds when the ship's condition was clearer. Others obeyed instructions and found that obedience itself could not create enough room where too little room existed. The disaster was not democratic. It moved through the ship along existing lines of access and authority. There is a temptation, when telling this part of the story, to focus only on scenes of human feeling. Those feelings were real, but explanation still matters. Titanic became so deadly not only because it sank, but because it sank after carrying too few lifeboats, after losing precious time in the early phase of evacuation, and after placing different groups of people at unequal distance from survival. A modern ship had created an orderly social world. When that world began to fail, the same order that had once seemed efficient also shaped who could move quickly towards safety and who could not. As the last stage approached, the ship's physical condition became impossible to disguise. Water advanced upward through the vessel. The bow settled lower. More of the deck sloped toward the sea. The lights remained a powerful symbol in later memory because they represented the lingering presence of order, even as the structure holding that order together was being lost. Titanic did not pass abruptly from perfect calm into instant disappearance. It went down through a drawn-out interval in which the ship remained visible, inhabited, and partly recognizable almost until the end. By about 2:20 a.m. on 15 April 1912, the process was over. Titanic slipped beneath the surface of the North Atlantic. For the people in the lifeboats, the disaster did not end at the moment the ship vanished. They were now adrift in darkness, surrounded by cold and distance, listening to what remained after a giant vessel had disappeared. For the people who entered the water, the situation was even more brutal. The sea was lethally cold. Survival in those conditions was measured not in long struggle, but in very short intervals. This is another place where restraint matters. The water itself became the final force of the disaster. It did not need embellishment. It was enough that hundreds of people were left exposed to conditions the human body could not endure for long. Lifeboat capacity had determined who remained above the water and who did not. Once Titanic was gone, that division became almost absolute. What remained on the surface was a broken geography of survival. Scattered lifeboats, exhausted people, and the knowledge that rescue was still on its way but had not yet arrived. Carpathia's approach mattered enormously, yet it belonged to the next phase of the story. This chapter ends in the interval between loss and rescue. The ship was gone. The arithmetic of the boats had already decided much of the human outcome. The sea had turned the disaster from emergency into aftermath. That aftermath would soon become public memory, political inquiry, and international reform. But before it became any of those things, it was silence on cold water, interrupted only by the movements of boats, the work of survivors, and the slow arrival of help from beyond the horizon. Titanic had been built as a monument to confidence and continuity. In the end, it left behind lifeboats carrying only part of its human world, and a question that would not disappear with the wreck itself. How could so much modern order end in such overwhelming loss within a single night? When Titanic disappeared beneath the surface, the disaster did not end. It changed form. What had been a crisis aboard a ship became a scattered aftermath spread across lifeboats, cold water, distance, and waiting. The people who had found places in the boats were no longer facing the immediate mechanics of evacuation, but they were still far from safety. They remained in darkness on the North Atlantic, carrying shock, uncertainty, and the knowledge that the ship itself was gone. This interval between sinking and rescue is important because it reminds us that survival was not completed the moment a person entered a boat. The lifeboats were fragile spaces of temporary preservation, not final refuge. They held people who had escaped the ship, but not yet the disaster. Cold exhaustion, confusion, and incomplete knowledge still shaped the hours that followed. Many survivors did not yet know who else had escaped, who had been lost, or when another vessel would arrive. RMS Carpathia, which had answered Titanic's distress calls, moved through the night toward the survivors. That response was one of the most consequential acts in the entire story. Without it, the scale of survival would have been smaller still. Carpathia did not erase the disaster, but it transformed what came after by giving those in the lifeboats a destination and a chance to leave the open sea alive. The rescue unfolded boat by boat. Survivors were brought aboard, counted, wrapped, fed, and placed into whatever order could be restored after such a night. Carpathia was not a floating courtroom or memorial at that moment. It was, first of all, a rescue vessel taking in cold, exhausted people who had been separated from family, possessions, and certainty. The work was practical before it was symbolic. Blankets, warmth, food, shelter, and basic organization mattered immediately. Yet symbolism entered very quickly as well. Once the survivors were aboard Carpathia, the disaster acquired a new visibility. It was no longer only a maritime emergency. It became an event that had to be reported, interpreted, and understood by the wider world. Wireless communication, which had already played such an important role during the sinking, now helped carry news of the catastrophe outward. The world learned that one of the most famous ships ever built had been lost on her maiden voyage. Public attention was immediate and global. This global shock was not accidental. Titanic had been a ship of unusual size, prestige, and publicity before it sailed. It represented more than transport. It represented a wider confidence in industrial order, commercial prestige, and modern engineering. That is one reason why the news of the disaster struck with such force. A vessel that had stood for security and grandeur had vanished in a single night, and it had done so while carrying people from many different social worlds. The event felt large not only because of the number of lives lost, but because of what the ship had seemed to promise before the collision. When Carpathia approached New York, that symbolic dimension became even more visible. Crowds, journalists, officials, and relatives gathered in anticipation. The arrival of survivors turned abstract reports into human fact. Lists of names mattered. Absences mattered more. The disaster now had to be translated into public knowledge. Who had survived? Who had not? What had happened on the ship? And how such a thing could have occurred. This movement from sea disaster to public reckoning is where the inquiries begin to matter. The sinking did not pass into history as a private tragedy accepted without examination. Almost immediately, institutions sought to establish cause, responsibility, and procedure. In the United States Senate inquiry began, while survivors were still close enough to the event for direct testimony to be gathered with urgency. In Britain, the British Wreck Commissioner's inquiry would also take up the case. These were not identical proceedings, but together they formed the official attempt to understand what the loss of Titanic revealed. The point of these inquiries was not simply to assign moral outrage to a single person and then close the matter. They were trying to answer a more demanding set of questions. How had the collision happened? How had warnings been handled? Why had there been so few lifeboat places relative to the number of people aboard? How had the evacuation proceeded? What had officers, crew, and company leadership understood, and when had they understood it? These questions were practical as well as political because the answers would shape future maritime safety. It is important not to turn the hearing rooms into a drama of perfect clarity. Testimony after disaster is never simple. Memory is uneven. Witnesses observe different fragments of the same event. Public pressure can sharpen some details while distorting others. The inquiries did not produce an untouched, complete truth that solved every uncertainty forever. But they did force the disaster into a structured examination, and that examination made it harder for the shipping world to treat Titanic as a freak misfortune that required no broader reform. At a high level, several themes became central. One was speed in an ice field and the broader culture of confidence surrounding large liners. Another was lifeboat provision and the gap between regulation and actual passenger capacity. Another concerned wireless practice, not just the existence of the technology, but how it was staffed, prioritized, and integrated into emergency procedure. And beyond these specific questions lay a larger issue: whether modern maritime systems had grown faster than the safety assumptions that governed them. This is why Titanic mattered historically beyond its own wreck. The disaster exposed a mismatch between technological scale and safety culture. A ship could be advanced, prestigious, and carefully engineered and still operate within rules that lagged behind the realities of its size and public role. In that sense, the sinking was not simply the failure of one voyage. It was a warning about the limits of a system that had trusted visible sophistication more than full preparedness for worst-case loss. Some of the most lasting changes that followed were practical. Lifeboat expectations changed. The older regulatory logic that tied lifeboat requirements to outdated tonnage categories, rather than to all persons on board, became increasingly untenable. Titanic made that impossible to ignore. The lesson was not subtle. If a liner could carry more people than its boats could hold, then the system itself was flawed. Wireless practice also changed in lasting ways. The disaster had shown the value of radio communication, but it had also shown that the existence of the technology alone was not enough. Reliability, staffing, and continuity mattered. A rescue system cannot depend only on the presence of equipment. It also depends on procedures that ensure signals can be sent, received, and acted upon at the right times. Titanic helped push the maritime world toward more regularized expectations around wireless readiness. The ice problem itself was addressed more systematically as well. One of the most important longer-term outcomes was the creation of the International Ice Patrol. That institution reflected a basic recognition. The North Atlantic could not simply be left to custom, scattered warning traffic, and individual judgment if the movement of large passenger vessels was to be made safer. Information about ice had to be gathered and communicated more consistently. In this sense, Titanic contributed not only to memory but to infrastructure. The broader reform landscape is often associated with safety of life at sea. That phrase matters because it captures the shift from isolated reaction to general principle. The disaster helped bring about a new insistence that maritime safety could not remain a secondary matter addressed only after major loss. It had to be treated as an international, organized, and continuing responsibility. Titanic did not by itself invent that principle, but it gave it overwhelming force. These reforms should not be described as if they redeemed the disaster. They did not undo the loss, and they did not erase the failures of the night. But they do matter because they show that the sinking changed the rules by which later ships would move through the same ocean. Maritime history is full of tragedy, yet not every tragedy alters systems so visibly. Titanic did. It became one of those disasters after which the old arrangement could no longer be defended in quite the same way. At the same time, Titanic did not remain only an object of inquiry and reform. It also entered culture, memory, and legend. This part of the story has to be handled carefully. The ship became famous not merely because it sank, but because the event lent itself to repeated retelling. It involved wealth and migration, class and technology, confidence and collapse, heroism and failure, order and cold indifference. In other words, it contained many of the tensions through which modern societies understand themselves. That is why Titanic expanded beyond the documented event into a larger symbolic life. Stories gathered around it. Some were grounded in testimony and contemporary evidence. Others became simplified, embellished, or repeated because they gave the disaster a cleaner emotional shape than history usually allows. The result is that Titanic exists today in two related forms. It exists as a historical event with evidence, institutions, causes, and consequences. And it exists as a legend carried through books, films, illustrations, exhibitions, and public imagination. The historical task is not to reject memory entirely, but to keep legend from swallowing the event. When myth becomes too strong, it can flatten what actually matters. It can replace structure with anecdote, reform with sentiment, and social explanation with a few familiar scenes repeated endlessly. Dream history should resist that temptation. The power of Titanic lies not only in what people remember seeing in their minds, but in what the disaster revealed about class, regulation, communication, and the limits of confidence in an industrial age. This is also why the final meaning of Titanic is larger than the ship itself. The vessel sank in April 1912, but the world that produced it did not disappear that night. Much of that world would continue into an even more violent decade. The assumptions of hierarchy, progress, prestige, and managed risk that shaped Titanic were still active across the early 20th century. In that sense, the ship can be understood not only as a singular tragedy, but as a window into a broader historical order that believed deeply in its own coherence. And yet the story remains deeply human in scale. Survivors carried the memory into the rest of their lives. Families unsure carried absence. Publics on both sides of the Atlantic carried the shock. Institutions carried the burden of answering what should change. A modern legend formed, but it formed out of cold water, uneven access to survival, administrative procedure, public testimony, and grief that did not need exaggeration to endure. This is the right place to end the series. Titanic began for us as a ship that seemed to carry an entire age. It became chapter by chapter a social world, a voyage, a collision, an evacuation, and a loss. It closes now as both history and warning. The warning is not only that the sea can be dangerous, it is that modern systems can look complete even when they contain hidden insufficiencies, and that confidence can delay recognition at the precise moment when time matters most. What remained after Titanic was therefore more than wreckage beneath the ocean. There were reforms, inquiries, new rules, and new institutions. There was also a more lasting kind of remainder. The memory of a world that trusted its own order deeply, and the knowledge that this order had failed in full public view. That is why Titanic still returns again and again in the historical imagination. Not because it was merely dramatic, but because it condensed so much of modernity into one voyage and one night. In the end, Titanic became unforgettable because it joined consequence to symbol. It changed maritime safety in concrete ways, and it also became a story through which later generations would think about ambition, vulnerability, and loss. The ship went down once. Its meaning did not. It continued forward in law, in memory, in historical debate, and in the quiet persistence of a question that still feels modern even now. How much faith should any age place in the systems that seem to protect it best?